All right. Well, welcome everybody. It is my great honor and responsibility to introduce the great Dr. Corrine Carvalho to you, which I will do. Dr. Corrine Carvalho is professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she has just completed 24 years and recently shifted back to being, quote, just a plain old professor. Those are her words, after a stint as interim dean of social work. Dr. Carvalho has worked extensively in Ezekiel, and she is one of the rare people in the field of Hebrew Bible who has the ability to reach broadly across methodologies and disciplines, always in search of the bigger so what questions. She's both a careful, rigorous exegete of the text, and she also incorporates methods and perspectives into her work, such as gender and sexuality, violence and trauma, and contemporary media, even video games. She's currently working on the commentary on Ezekiel for the Wisdom Commentary series, and part of what she's working on in this paper, as she told me, is fleshing out her conceptual configurations of gender in the prophets. I will also add that Dr. Carvalho has been part of the CBA since 1987, and she wants everyone to know that she's very fun at parties, which I can attest to, and she is certainly the life of the party at the CBA. And because Archie already let this information slip during the Liturgy of the Word, I can also say that Dr. Carvalho was just elected the new general editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. Mazel tov. And I also need to put forth the virtual meeting protocol, which you will hear at every single session for which you are part, which has been sent to the registrants. It's posted on the CBA website. I would like to remind you of the following. You are expected to identify yourselves by your real names, please. Please do not record this presentation in audio or video. You are encouraged to use the Zoom features to communicate, but inappropriate comments or behavior will lead to immediate removal from the conference. And a videotape of this session will be posted to the CBA website. By agreeing to appear in the Zoom window with audio or visual contributions, you grant permission to the CBA to broadcast your likeness to social media outlets. At the end of this talk, you can also, and I'll repeat this at the end, you can raise your hand, kind of the little raise hand function on the bottom of your screen, and I'll call on you, or you can just write a comment or a question in the chat box, and I'll try to be screening those. If you raise your hand, you actually will be pulled into the video, so you will appear on the screen to ask your question. If you stay in the box, you will not. So just be aware of that. So without further ado, here is Dr. Corrine Carvalho with a paper titled, Unless You Have Utterly Rejected Us, Male Sexual Trauma and Theology in Israelite Exilic Literature.
Thank you so much, Mari. I really appreciate that. And again, I'm humbled. So my paper title has changed slightly. I'm now calling it No More Toxic Masculinity, but it's still the same abstract and the same ideas. So let me begin so that we have time for conversation at the end. I'm hoping that we have enough time for that. So when I was asked to give a half plenary at the CBA 2 years ago, we had no idea that COVID-19 would soon change our lives. We did not anticipate, although perhaps we should have, the come to Jesus moment of George Floyd's murder in my own hometown. Instead, if you can recall, we had had a moving and courageous panel on clergy sexual abuse, one that had just begun the conversation of a foundational culture that underpins not only genderism in our field, but the horrendous harvest of institutional trauma that plagues Catholicism, both Roman and small c Catholic. The time had seemed ripe for the continuation of the conversation with the success of the At Me Too movement and the smattering of convictions against predatory priests. I want to resume that conversation, not because I want to ignore the systemic racism that plagues biblical studies, but because I think the two issues, genderism and racism, share some of the same principles. My contribution to the conversation centers on the ways that gender and violence, especially in light of recent engagements with concepts such as embodiment, affect theory, and masculinity studies, has shifted the conversation in gender analyses of the prophets. While I recognize that not all survivors of clergy sexual abuse were male, I want to address that particular majority in this study, since I think it is a significant part of the lack of adequate communal response. So first, the problem. Feminist analysis of prophetic material is hardly in its infancy. In fact, the groundbreaking studies of Settle's pornoprophetics and Weems' application of domestic violence to the prophetic images were published before some of our younger members had even been born. Yet the gender analysis, especially of the marriage metaphors, quote unquote, continues at a robust pace. One saying I have heard and repeated is that every female biblical scholar must speak about Ezekiel 16 at least one time in print. I've had those most vigorous opposition to my analyses come from other feminist scholars who say my work does not go far enough, that I do not understand the way in which core concepts which undergird these biblical texts also feed into contemporary rape culture, and that I need to denounce the language in no uncertain terms. I still can't do that. So if you came today to hear my mea culpa, you will be sorely disappointed. Oh, it's not because I love these texts. In fact, I no more love Ezekiel 16 than I do the images of cannibalism and Lamentations. It is because I think we continue to misinterpret them. And in so doing, we miss the opportunity to leverage them to speak to those of us who benefit from the same systemic hierarchies. I think we need to listen instead of speak. I'm not alone in this journey. Similar chances have been taken by Carol Myers and Daniel Smith Christopher. In addition, most recently, Graybell has also questioned the dated concepts that are in some feminist analyses of narrative rape narratives. I build on their work as well as my own. I'm going to start my critique with a category that has been bothering me, the category of toxic masculinity. Let me be very clear. I understand the category. Toxic masculinity is a phrase that describes an ideal performance of masculine gender that is rooted in hegemonic gender dynamics and depends on privileged male dominance that is often performed through gendered words, clothing, affect, humor, social bonds, etc. It is a culture that utilizes compulsory silence to maintain the invisible cracks in the dominant ideology of hegemonic masculinity, which underpins colonial, political, and/or economic structures. My wariness centers around two elements. First, the term itself, and then second, the way the category has been used in the analysis of exilic and post-exilic Judean literature. First, the term. For me, toxic masculinity pays inordinate attention to the category of masculine performance as the agent in the discourse. This is not true just in biblical studies, but in sociological discussions as well, such as those by sociologist Michael Kimmel. The result of this discourse has occasionally ended up in a reverse sexism, where mothers are blamed for their sons' participation in such culture, where men are blamed as the toxic ones. What if we change the phrase to toxic gender expectations? I think such a change achieves two important things. First, it takes agency out of the equation. The expectation of gendered performances, just like the categories of systemic racism, are not created by those who must choose behaviors within those confines. Agency can be partially restored in active resistance to such categories. And such resistance does come with severe risks, as many non-conforming persons know. Second, the replacement of masculinity with gender undercuts the binary assumptions about gender that is an essential element in the phenomenon the phrase is pointing to. Performance of female gender forms an essential pairing to the performance of toxic masculinity. If one thinks about the themed undergrad parties from a few years ago, such as golf pros and tennis hoes, the inherent interdependence is laid bare. A horrible pun intended. In a similar vein, male to female trans performances of gender often knowingly play with this duality through hyper-feminization of drag performances and post coming out as trans. I'm thinking here of Jenner. Gender-based violence, both threatened and real, supports these compulsory performances, as we know. But the social silence around this policing speaks loudly about the social systems that depend on these categories. Male and on-male sexual assault in certain homosocial environments, prisons, frat parties, locker rooms, for example, plays an important role in the policing of male gender performance and establishment of hierarchy within a masculinized social hierarchy. Policing of female gender norms are seen in the assumptions of ownership over certain categories of females, including prostitutes, for those who look like them, intimate partners, wives, girlfriends, mistresses, and any female who is or is supposed to be subordinate. Neither of these phenomena have sufficiently been addressed in our current culture, and both contribute to the pandemic of clergy sexual abuse. Why have we, theologians, not sufficiently heard or responded to the voices of the survivors of such gender sexual-based violence? Is it because they are silent? Or is it because we do not hear them when they express their anger, violation, or fear? You may be asking, what does any of this have to do with prophets? I want to claim that the same whiteness or dominant culture of male study of the prophets continues to affect white feminist analyses of the same. In the United States, white Christians have colonized the Bible as our text, which resultantly is read as the voice of the privileged colonizer. The problems that have arisen in the post-Enlightenment reading of the text stem from this misplacement of our privilege onto the voice of the speakers of these texts, which in turn silences the speakers as colonized subjects. Or to put it more bluntly, we have co-opted the voices of colonized, and we continue to do so as long as we assert we have ownership over their text's meanings. By insisting that the images of violence in the prophetic texts are uttered by those with agency to perform them, we silence the anger of those, mostly male, who have been forcibly put in their place by Mesopotamian, Persian, Greek, Roman policing of colonized gender, masculine, feminine, and non-binary. So, male rape and scholarly silence. The Hebrew Bible is not silent on male vulnerability to sexual assault, at least in the narrative text, as the rise of publications on male rape narratives in the Hebrew Bible has demonstrated, especially by those by Schultz and Greenough. These scholars agree that such texts include the drugging of Lot by his daughters, Joseph at the literal hands of Mrs. Potiphar, Jael's reverse penetration of Sisera, and Samson's manhandling by Delilah and the Philistines. On the one hand, these texts are all set in Israel's distant past, a kind of great Game of Thrones of epic narrative history. As such, the rape tropes here may be more symbolic of atrocious power imbalance and demonization of the other than indications of the prevalence of male victimization in monarchic Israel. On the other hand, they do demonstrate awareness of the vulnerability of male bodies, especially in foreign contexts. This scholarship on male rape tackles two of the thorniest issues in this discourse: definition and anachronism. The literature on the definition of rape, both in the modern and the ancient world, is unable to be pursued within the bounds of this paper. I will simply say that I will use the term rape to mean penetration of another's body without consent. I use sexual assault to refer to all other non-consensual sexual contact. And I use sexual violence for any violation of a person's sexual integrity, such as forced viewing of partner rape or threat of rape through stripping and humiliation. I recognize the anachronistic element in my definitions. For me, the biggest problem is the word consent, a word that has changed even within my own lifetime. The most obvious shifts in the past century have been in its application both to rape within marriage and to those chemically impaired. The @Me Too movement has also brought to the fore the problem of consent within imbalanced power relationships. The expansion and regulation of Title IX definitions, a needed response to the rampant underreporting of sexual misconduct on college campuses, has similarly brought this topic into our classrooms. These shifts have changed the way students read the story of drunken Lot's victimization by his daughters, as well as the power differential between David and Bathsheba. It's made many of them uncomfortable with Ruth's uncovering of Boaz's feet on the threshing floor, although he does give a verbal consent once he awakes. It has been argued that in the ancient Levant, such structures of consent would not make sense. Olean has made what for me is a convincing case that Leviticus 19's prohibition on male penetration applies only to those within the same social stratum, that is, between those where consent is a meaningful concept. King Saul's accusation that Jonathan is the son of a, quote, perverse woman who has uncovered his mother's nakedness in 1 Samuel 20:30 similarly insinuates that Jonathan has allowed himself to be treated like David's inferior, again demonstrating that consent is not a concept that pertains to those of unequal status. The invisible residue of the assumption that consent is not in play when a relationship is already demonstrably unequal lies behind the ongoing and present toleration, if not outright expectation of sexual violence, as a regular component in prisons as well as armed conflict. So now I move to colonial manipulation of the male gaze. Significant work has brought to the fore the prominence of female sexual violence in the Prophets and Lamentations. Washington and others have noted the ways that the texts reflect the practice of rape in war. Lamentations 5:11 explicitly references the rape of women in fallen Jerusalem, while Zechariah 14:2 includes rape as a threat and defeat of the city. Schultz traces how commentaries and translations have tempered the violent images through circumlocutions and alternative translations, such as the translation of quote in Isaiah 3:17 as forehead rather than pudenda. Although the Assyrian reliefs do not depict this bellicose practice, as Chapman has pointed out, the reality of female rape is attested in other biblical texts, such as Sisera's mother in Judges 5, and in a variety of ancient texts, such as Kirta's militarized abduction of a wife, Gilgamesh's newlywed penetrations, and some of the Mesopotamian city laments. As a result, scholarly focus on prophetic texts is centered on women's fate, because the most overt instances of rape in the prophetic material involves female victims. These include both the threat or occurrence of actual rape in texts such as Isaiah 3, Jeremiah 13, but also the metaphoric rape of the city in Nahum 3 and Ezekiel 16 and 23. Scholars such as Chapman and Smith Christopher have noted that rape of females was a method of shaming colonized males. As heads of households, landowning males performed both their gender and privilege by protecting the members of those households. To be sure, they also performed that privilege by various forms of slut shaming a female member of the household who violated his ownership. Because sexual control was so tied to male honor, this practice removed the shame from the male and placed it on the female. And in those cases, the male has agency. In contrast, the rape of women in war occurs as part of the stripping of agency of male elites. This explains why so many of the prophetic texts rhetorically create witnesses of the sexual violence. Note, the language of most of the poems focus on the stripped female body. Skirts are lifted, pudenda exposed, ready for penetration, the act of which is not overly described. These poems create visual objects of the male gaze, but this object has two observers, the conquering perpetrator and the shamed male, rendered impotent by the assault on the female body. By focusing on the gaze of the assault, the trope manipulates male victims whose privileged gaze of their wives' bodies transforms into the shaming gaze of that body, now victimized by the gaze of the evil other. In this way, the colonizer usurps the privilege of the colonized. So now Ezekiel and the colonized male gaze. While some scholars caution that there is little direct evidence of the use of sexual violence against males in the biblical text, It seems obvious that men who wrote extended metaphors of their feminized city being sexually assaulted utilize images that connected to their own intergenerational experience of the rape of wives and daughters. Nahum 3's depiction of the rape of Nineveh recreates the rape of women in a sacked city. The toxic masculinity, if you will, in this chapter does not adhere to the poet, it adheres to the colonizer. Since the Judeans did not participate in the sack of Nineveh, the poem represents a rhetorical use of the, quote, master's tools, that is a deliberate use of colonizing tactics to describe the nation's colonization of Judah's avenging deity. It's somehow easier to accept the anger in Nahum against an evil empire, since language fits our own rape tropes. The interpretive strategy becomes more difficult when texts depict that same God sexually assaulting Judeans. The problem for contemporary readers, and I suspect for ancient readers as well, is which character serves as the avatar for the audience. Since no gender analysis of rape in the prophetic text can exclude a discussion of Ezekiel 16 and 23, the question for today is, whose voice is silenced in our professional feminist interpretations of these texts? The intended impact of the shocking images has worked its literary magic across generations. In fact, I sometimes wonder how much longer it would have taken biblical scholarship to notice the connection between the Bible and contemporary rape culture if the book of Ezekiel had never made it into the canon. Schultz summarizes 3 approaches to rape texts made by scholars: renunciation of ideologies in the text, historicization of those ideologies, and uncovering counter-testimony or deconstruction of the dominant ideology. I use the historical contextualization of language because I do think that the historical context needs to be an essential part of any theological appropriation. To be sure, the reception of biblical text also must be considered, but rehistoricizing language is one strategy to undermine the received meaning of the text. Part of the rhetorical strategy used by the author or authors of Ezekiel is to adopt and then expand on traditions found in other Israelite literature. Without getting into detailed questions of dating and redaction, let me simply state that I believe that these traditions were circulating in primarily oral form, with scribalization as a secondary method of preservation. These texts may reflect the immediate experience of those who went through exile. They might, but they certainly include the voices of those who experienced that trauma intergenerationally. The texts in Ezekiel were preserved and redacted by the metaphorical sons and grandsons of Ezekiel, just as those in Jeremiah and certainly Isaiah were as well. If we think of this prophetic material as stemming from or assuming a performative morality, contemporary parallels to the language shift from that of literary dependence to that of performative. It shifts from that of literary dependence to that of performative interdependence. In other words, placing the versions of sexual victimization of Nineveh and Nahum 3 and Jerusalem and Ezekiel 23 within that performative context transforms them into a kind of slam poetry event where the artistry depends on the echoing and transformation of previous performances. Just as the rape of women in war targeted the gazing audience, so too the slam poetry of the prophets targets the hearing audience, eliciting strong reactions as it triggers their emotions. One of the big debates in feminist analysis of this material is whether these pieces reinforce the assumptions that undergird a rape culture or whether they reflect those. So what and whose emotions do the texts aim to elicit? I maintain that the book of Ezekiel's hyperbolic language is primarily for a Judean and Yehudite male audience about their gendered experiences. For me, the ramifications of this are acute. When reading the chapters from the perspective of the colonized male gaze, the rape motif does something very similar to Lamentations. It replaces the colonizing Babylon with Yahweh. While this is a troubled ethical theology for us, it is a rhetorical move by the audience to co-opt the gaze of the colonizer and place it again with the colonized. The author of these chapters recognizes that this creates a bizarre and warped reality, one where agency is returned to the colonized male gaze, but that agency that could have only prevented the shame they now experience can only have been done if they had performed their masculinity as a colonized subject of Yahweh. Shame or acute recognition of subservience is a common theme throughout the whole book. Ezekiel 20 notes that Israel's historical agency led them repeatedly to fail because they did not recognize that when it comes to God, the only appropriate agency is consent. Ezekiel 16 and 23 use sexualized images to portray the same web of intertwining concepts. First, that consent means nothing in situations of imbalance of power. Second, the Babylonian rape of Judeans is part of their assertion of power. And third, the Babylonians' assumptions are incorrect because they have no power in relationship with Israel's God. So that's the text message. Feminist scholars are correct that these texts are not contesting the use of rape as an assertion of power. But I would maintain that these texts do demonstrate awareness of the horror of rape and thereby do critique it. Note that the paradigmatic evil that the evil empire performs is that of sexual violence. The author of Ezekiel deliberately chooses images that elicit emotional responses, such as the city as a bloody pot or the field of fleshless femurs. These images come directly from the legacy of the fall of Jerusalem, and the text creates sites of memory of that devastation. But this is no Holocaust museum which positions the victims as nonviolent sufferers. No, it's ancient hip-hop culture, an expression of anger through the reconfiguration of traditional cultural elements. Perhaps our hardest assumption that these texts reflect is the fact that we cannot create a world without rape. Nahum 3 and Jeremiah 50 through 51 solve, quote unquote, the problem of colonial violence through revenge fantasies. Ezekiel 16 and 23 in the Book of Lamentations do so through removing agency from the colonizer and projecting it onto God. But none of these envision a world without rape. Maybe Jeremiah 31:22 with the whole new thing, but that's another paper. This reality for me also prohibits any community, including our own professional one, from asserting that manipulation of the biblical traditions will somehow solve the problem of rampant sexual violence. Ezekiel actually understands this. All power relationships are violent and gendered, even those with God. Just ask any Catholic woman who has been denied ordination. The focus on shame in the book as a desired outcome expresses this conclusion. The perspective of the book of Ezekiel exposes the hubris of thinking that there might be a human society capable of avoiding rape culture, even ours, today, right now. Can't avoid it. If we did not have Ezekiel 16, would we have a rape-free culture? Isn't it more likely that rape would become simply more invisible again? Just like the violent images in hip-hop culture, the sexual violence in Ezekiel 16 participates in the creation of site of memory that gives voice to the unspeakable reality of sexual trauma. Not just because survivors have trouble finding the words, because once they do find their voice, they're told to be silent. I worry that feminist scholars are doing that again, demanding that victims be silenced. How dare we tell Ezekiel and his audience to be silent? While most discussions of sites of memory focus on physical sight, texts can function in the same way. The sexual violence depicted in Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel function as sites that capture the horrendous legacy of systemic gender violence that was and is part of ancient and modern war. These prophetic texts express both the reality that gender violence uncovers a group most vulnerable private selves, while it also warps communal trust in a protective divine world. The narrative portrayal of Israel's God in these extended metaphors captures the complex and conflicted relationship that results from such communal trauma, a non-Socratic mix of terror, chaos, and control. Testimonies from survivors of clergy sexual abuse also contain the same mix of violation of the victim's most internal self and resulting warping of the relationship and complexity with God and the community. But unlike the biblical texts, which function to bring survivors, witnesses, and multi-generations together to recognize the communal trauma, the contemporary church has no corresponding site of memory. A new move now to Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and colonized male performativity. The silencing of prophetic voices is not the answer to rape culture. Jeremiah wasn't silent. This prophetic text uses the character of Jeremiah as the avatar through which the audience experiences the terrors of the fall of Jerusalem. In my earlier work, I have examined the performances of masculinity by the characters of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, concluding that each addresses the compromised masculinity inherent in the fall of the elites in Jerusalem, although in different ways. The book of Jeremiah also intertwines the feminization and victimization of the city, as in other prophetic books. But in addition to that, Jeremiah's own gender identity stands as a cipher for masculinized violence. Studies of male rape in the Hebrew Bible have brought the sexual violence that percolates beneath the poem in Jeremiah 20 to the fore. While there are debates about the degree to which the word that is translated as entice in the NRSV implies rape, at the very least, the verse could be translated in modern parlance as, "You fucked me over and I am fucked." Jeremiah 20 gives voice to why Judean males in the exilic and post-exilic eras created and preserved poems that depict God as the rapist. First, it implies that men were fucked in the fall of Jerusalem. The iconographic evidence depicts the gaze of the conquering Assyrians resting on the stripped, degraded, and mutilated male bodies of the conquered. What the prophetic texts speak of metaphorically, male bodies turned into female bodies, comes into sharp focus in the reliefs. When Jerusalem's skirts are raised over the head, the body is actually that of a castrated, mutilated, and raped collective male body. The poetry in Jeremiah gives voice to male anger at this gendered violation, just as the punchlines in Ezekiel bring shame into center stage. Both characters perform colonized masculinity, albeit in different ways. Jeremiah's characterization as compromised male is more overt. With marriage and parenthood denied to him, he fails to achieve the privileged status of adult males. He has little agency throughout the book. God forces him to deliver terrorizing messages, and the audience receives these speeches with policing brutality. Ezekiel's compromised male status is more subtle. He's exiled away from any position of status, and his wife's death make him a corporeal prophetic sign of the fall of the temple. Scholars have noted the phallic elements of the scroll ingestion in Ezekiel 3. Although scholars have generally rejected Halperin's conclusion that Ezekiel had experienced sexual abuse by his mother, Bohr highlighted the sexualizing images in the passage as a kind of intellectual masturbation by privileged scribes. While I accept most of the sexual innuendo in the material that both of them discuss, I think that Bohr in particular has projected the privilege of contemporary academia onto ancient scribal cultures, ignoring their colonized context. I read both Jeremiah 20 and Ezekiel 3 as guarded language reflecting the sexual assault on male bodies, not only and perhaps not even primarily as part of battle, but as a continued practice in colonized contexts. Note that both figures have a complicated relationship with the divine agent of force. For Jeremiah, there is intimacy demonstrated by dialogue, which does allow for some protestation, and protestation there is. For Ezekiel, the sodomizing scroll evokes the sweetness of honey, a testimony to a kind of pleasure in the act, This complicated relationship that Ezekiel has with God renders him without the ability to express himself without God's permission. He is silenced. The books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel provide brutally honest testimony to the fact that the legacy of sexual violence is complicated and far-reaching. These two persona, who represent the male experience of gender defeat, attest to the variety of implications of such experience. Jeremiah depicts the complicated relationship the survivor and his community have with intimacy, identity, and relationship with God. The poet has placed powerful amends on the lips of this prophetic figure to give expression to the legacy of systemic gender violence. The figure of Ezekiel embodies a different response, one of paralysis, physically, socially, but also vocally. Ezekiel loses all agency in the book, forced to speak only what the dominant power allows him to say. When he does speak, the world he attests to is one that is irredeemably evil, unable to contain anything good on its own, filled with putrefying events, words, and actions. He's only freed of this bond once his last item of privileged masculinity, his wife, is taken from him. He does not attain autonomy until there's nothing left for him to have agency over. These same responses to systemic gender violence continue today. The portrayal of these two representatives of ancient communal trauma capture the complexity of survivor stories, including those male survivors of sexual violence, including clergy sexual abuse. They exhibit a similar variety of responses, from inability to communicate, problems with intimate relationships, lack of trust in others, and questioning their own gendered identities. Their theological responses also vary, from rejection of all religious claims to dedicated life of service to God, some as priests. These theological responses perhaps best parallel the depictions in Jeremiah and Ezekiel of the complexity of that human-divine relationship. The third text I want to talk about is Isaiah 56, Eunuchs for God and Systemic Castration. Isaiah 56 contains one of the most explicit statements about the awareness of gendered sexual violence in the prophetic corpus, and it hinges on the debated meaning of the word saris in biblical text. While it is true that the term saris does not always mean a castrated male, the allusions in this chapter to male infertility clearly mark this passage as reflecting the reality of castrated males in post-exilic Yehud. Within the broader ancient Near Eastern iconographic record, the easy identification of castrated males demonstrates their prevalence. It is important to note, however, that these figures with beardless faces and softer muscularity attest to the practice of prepubescent mutilation. While these men hold various administrative roles, how they were chosen for these roles as children is unknown, and I don't count Herodotus as an unreliable resource. Of course, we can imagine some scenarios, such as the capture of young boys in a city is sacked, or the relief of debt by selling a boy into servitude. It could be that most male offspring of slave couples were automatically castrated. But do these occasional sources for castrated male servants fit the record? Or was it a more institutionalized practice? Eunuchs, as a regular element of the iconographic record from the ancient Near East, including Assyria, Egypt, and Persia, indicate a systemic institutionalized practice which undergirded colonial empires, even if not all of its elements are sufficiently known today. What has not been queried is the social impact that this practice might have had among the groups whose male children fed that system. Assyrian wall reliefs depict adult males stripped and mutilated, but those castrati do not result in the eunuchs depicted in the iconographic record. Adult castration does not result in the same soft face and bodies of the eunuchs that we're able to point out today. So it makes us realize that how many other males, such as unarmored infantry, slave laborers, or caravan service, also came from post-battle sexual mutilations. Were these males rendered as invisible to their ancient community as they are to us? And I do sometimes wonder whether a polite silence that we find in the biblical text on post-battle castration could be behind the metaphor, especially prominent in Jeremiah, that likens male suffering in battle to a woman in labor. Whether those are also relating the sexual pain of that mutilation to a woman's pain and labor. No matter what, the post-battle mutilations would have factored into communal trauma, but the experience of battlefield castration would have been limited to that traumatic event, as opposed to repeated systemic communal trauma. The regularized practice of castration of prepubescent males, evident in the iconography of colonizing empires, would have had a different social effect on a multi-generational community. While the context of the physical act of castration may not have been traumatic, the larger context, the result would have been borne by a whole community. I would expect that these males came primarily from non-elite groups. They may have disproportionately come from outsider or refugee populations. Note, for instance, that the name Sars in Jeremiah Eben Melech, whom I take to be a castrati, is also designated as a foreigner. Prepubescent mutilation of exiled and refugee male populations would have created a workforce within elite systems, circles that did not threaten the legitimacy of male progeny, and that may have been easier to control since they would have usually not had the muscularity of non-castrated males. This may have also included an educated workforce needed in the empirical bureaucracy. The practice of sexual mutilation would have also created a compromised attitude in those whose sons entered the workforce. On the one hand, it was a sign of continued subjugation to the elite, but on the other, it provided opportunities for work, access to food, and perhaps a better life than other diasporic males would have had. In addition, the threat of castration could have been used to keep non-castrated males, in particular fathers, wanting to protect the rest of their households in line. This systemic castration would have been practiced across an empire, and so would have affected not only Chaldeans, but those residing in Yehud under Persian colonization. Isaiah 56 expresses the recommunion of two groups of victims of colonizing sexual violence, men and women. The acceptance of castrated males into full communion with the assembly revises Israelite law forbidding their participation in the cult. And I know there's debates about what it's actually commenting on. But it does so in recognition that their mutilation is not a sign or omen indicating divine rejection. Their castration was a result of abusive power relationships within the human hierarchy. These castrati or eunuchs are paralleled with males who've been sired by foreigners. Reading these two categories within the colonized context, these could be men whose mothers were raped by foreign overlords. They're not children of wanton women who have agency to go after foreign men. These are women who are denied consent or agency because of the power differential between them and their impregnators. In other words, the passage addresses the necessary reconfiguration of family and inheritance in a context where consent does not exist. It surprises me that scholars have discussed these texts for so long, but rarely do so in terms of the male bodies they reflect, the notable exception being the work of Wright and Chan. In fact, it surprises me how nonchalantly scholars describe eunuchs in the ancient world. This is an example of the kind of historicization that Schultz denounces. In what ways does the ecclesial system of the Catholic Church recreate its own functioning eunuchs, men who commit to a life of privilege within the institution by sacrificing their gender performance? Is the sexual abuse that occurred in Catholic seminaries in particular part of the symbolic castration of future priests? Was it an expression of anger of those who inherently felt the sacrifice was unjust or unnatural, to use a Thomistic term? I won't venture a guess. I will only say that the supposed voluntary celibacy of today's priests is as systemically required as the castration of males in service to monarchs addressed in Isaiah 56. So the prophet's anger and oral expression to pull things together. This quick survey of the effects of male victimization through sexual violence in the major prophets has noted 3 ways that prophetic texts give voice to male experience of sexual violence. First, through the traumatization of witnessing the sexual assault of females. Second, through the experience of being turned into a colonizer's bitch in ways that included the threat of and probable use of sodomization. And third, through the social anxiety produced by those who had experienced male genital mutilation, either as victims or as family members. These texts demonstrate that male sexual violence constituted one strategy used by colonizing powers, and that the exilic and post-exilic texts give voice to male experience of intergenerational systemic sexual victimization. Now, I understand why it's taken so long to talk about male victimization as reflected in the Bible. Second wave feminism has changed the way we've seen all of these texts. But even with third wave feminism, male rape remains poorly studied. To be sure, it's statistically less often, but its gendered, social, and embodied context give it a distinct meaning. So the last question I want to address today is whether the legacy of this normalization of the sexual violence against males as recorded in the biblical text has contributed to pervasive sexual violence against males in the somosocial context of our ecclesial structures. Now, I do not pretend to be a church historian or sociologist. This is a parallel move that I make based on my own feminist convictions that our gender assumptions in interpreting biblical texts have contributed to a toxic gender system. Other scholars have examined how Christian configurations of concepts of embodiment, purity, chastity, for example, have contributed to clergy sexual abuse. As a biblical scholar, though, who benefits from the tradition of Catholic higher education, which I am, I think I have an obligation to ponder how I can use my privilege to be an ally to my contemporary survivors of systemic sexual violence against males specifically. I've noticed throughout my paper that one element of domination is silencing, and I don't want to be silent anymore. First, I want to say, I see you, I believe you. But as a biblical scholar, I want to take one more step, an important one given the cultural context, and that is the biblical text did not remain silent on this topic. It is reticent, to be sure, but through the polite silence, the authors of Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 20 revealed that they understand the complexity and injustice of compromised masculinity. Even more importantly, however, the text also attests to the necessity of anger as a needed response. Our liturgies avoid anger. I asked my class, with students from a variety of denominations this year, if they felt they could be angry in church. This actually led to the most impactful class session of the year. I didn't expect it. They attested that they could not, that somehow they felt they had to leave their anger outside the door when they entered the church. I called it a sieve that we place on our church doors that prevents people from bringing their authentic selves into that space. And yet, the biblical text is rife with anger, which is even projected onto God as a divine emotion. What would church look like if we embrace the prophetic call to anger? Oh, this isn't just a church problem, it's a social problem. And I teach in the Twin Cities. The anger following on George Floyd's murder was palpable. I view the protests that have followed and continued over the past year as communal rituals of anger taken to the streets, because in our churches, at least the Minnesota nice white churches, they aren't creating an effective ritual space for that. What is a proper biblical ritual response to male rape? It's not just rituals of mea culpa. These reinscribe the power, privilege, and do nothing to unsettle it. The proper biblical ritual is hearing the voices of the angry, bringing the victims into the center of our ritual space and experiencing the shame at what we have let happen without comment. I knew what was going on. I suspect many of you who are around my age also knew. But the concept of screaming in church, well, that still doesn't exist. In addition, the prophetic texts remind us that the systemic control of gender performance through sexual violation, as seen in the clergy abuse cases, affects families and communities intergenerationally In other words, even if its occurrence is much less now, and the institutional responses now are more appropriate, the legacy of the communal trauma still clings to our professional, vocational, and social familial communities. Silencing the anger of the prophets reflects our own privilege of not wanting to face what we have participated in, the structures we have unwillingly supported. Let's march. Let's carry the actual Bible into that march and wave it in appropriate anger. Let's give agency and voice back to our victims and see in them those who are truly in persona Christi. And let's not enter into the false dichotomy of competing oppressions. All genders have been hurt by toxic gender norms, but we can resist by pledging to be allies to each other. In conclusion, reading and preaching the prophets through the lens of sexual violence against men offers 3 insights for contemporary audiences. First, they remind us that systemic sexual trauma damages whole communities, from families to communities, and those effects have intergenerational consequences. The anger of those whose spouses, partners, children, parents were sexually assaulted need avenues for expressing their own anger at perpetrators, systems, and God. Second, they caution against reinforcing the false dichotomy of male rapist and female victim. While sexual violence occurs within that dichotomous matrix of gender meanings, our conceptual responses need to resist that particular hierarchy by recognizing a more complex matrix of multi-gendered survivors, allies, witnesses, and heirs. And third, we need to continue to uncover hidden transcripts of power and control, which contribute to the complexity of notions of agency and consent, in order to find more appropriate ways to shift our culture, all the while using our privilege to alleviate those most vulnerable to abuse. Only then will we be able to move more fully, only then will we be able to more fully respond to the systemic violence against men and boys, women, girls, third gender persons that have occurred within the institutional church settings that we serve, support, and benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corey. That was incredibly powerful and provocative and very real talk. So we have, unfortunately, not a whole lot of time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead. I've got some on the chat box already. So I'm going to go ahead and just ask you some of these questions that I'm seeing in the chat box. If somebody would also like to raise their hand, then we will actually draw you into the presentation so you can ask a question yourself if we have time to do that. So I'll just jump right in. There's a question from Amy Fielder. In response to your question about listening to victims' witness in addition to shame, which might be understandable, I also believe that victims don't speak out because it is hard to tell a story that does not have an ending. At least that was something of which I was personally conscious. Have you considered this possibility?
So I assume the question is more about modern, contemporary. There is no ending, actually. Is there any ending for trauma? Can you read the second part? What I want to...
Sure. It was, I also believe victims don't speak out because it is hard to tell a story that does not have an ending.
This is so true. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And you're right. I haven't thought about it specifically here, but yeah, I would agree.
Okay, I have another question from Andrew Davis.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think your reading of Ezekiel 16 gives us a way to think about the chapter's length? It's twice as long as most of the book's chapters. And I've often been struck by the way this length holds the audience captive to the disturbing allegory when we would rather move on to the next chapter.
Yeah, I think it really does. Yeah, because to me, if it's trying to express what it felt like to have to gaze on the rape of women in your community, which had to feel like an interminable length. It's just, you see it in modern stories, for instance, when rapists, I think about I know him as East Area rapist, who made men watch him rape their wives. and the length of that. So I think that that's part of the rhetorical device. I also think it's important to read 23 and 24 together, because they both use wife imagery in different ways that I think are trying to have conversation with each other.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Corey. Next question is from Jamie Waters. Thank you very much for your thought-provoking paper. Do you think there are risks involved in highlighting the ways that texts like Jeremiah 13, lifting up skirts, were shameful for men? Are men and women the victims, or only the women?
Okay, I need to see that question. I'm having trouble with my auditory brain. Keeping here is on the highlight. Yeah. Obviously there are risks. I do think that. And I do think that we can't ignore our own cultural context for who's more at risk today. But I honestly think that by not trying to uncover how these texts are reflecting male trauma, the risk is that we continue to be silent, that men are not affected by rape of any sort. You know, that men are not affected by rape of women, and that men are not affected by sexual violence against them, and men are not affected by threatened sexual violence. I just don't like that dichotomizing. So yeah, I think that these texts, I agree with those who say these texts have to be very thoughtfully preached and become part of the theological conversation. It can't be done haphazardly, and I think just reading them doesn't do it.
So I'll just go ahead and jump in there and ask a kind of final question to you, Corey, before
Does Michael have a question? Is that why he's on?
No, I think Michael is in accidentally. No, are you supposed to be here? You can stay, it's cool.
You're muted. Mike, you're muted.
I raised my hand and said, host asked you to turn on your video.
Oh,
Directions.
Michael, you've got the floor in the last question. Go for it.
Corey, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper very much, and I think you're really exploring new territory and opening up the question in ways that I certainly have never considered. But one thing, going back to Isaiah something, and this is a piece in Isaiah where he quotes, has a quote about the eunuch, and I'd just like to get your feedback on it, because it's Isaiah 56, 3-5. Do not, let me start here. Do not the foreigner be joined to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people, and do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose things that please me, and the Lord, and hold fast to my covenant. I will give my house within a walls, a monument, and a name better than the sons and daughters. I will give you an everlasting name that will not be cut off. So in light of everything you're talking about there, how do you interpret this, the colonization, colonizer, and all that? How do you put this phrase in Isaiah that he talks to the eunuch himself?
I think that he is saying the traditions that we have about how we think about gender have been so totally changed through colonization and through practices of systemic castration that we have to rethink our theological categories.
That's how you see. So you see in Isaiah as really reframing the whole question, reframing the whole issue, and that gives us a clue or a stepping stone on how we too should be doing the same thing.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I would read it. And I like I said, I read it, the foreigner, as being the the result of rape or other kinds of power.
Okay, can I just push on this a bit more?
Yeah.
Okay, so
we're
with
probably
that,
out of time.
okay, very quickly. The whole thing there then about the eunuch will somehow be redeemed. Will literally and figuratively, everything that the eunuch has lost will be regained. Is that like, am I reading that correctly?
Well, it's there are a lot of discussions about what that means. They will have a name and a monument, and I think that part of what that is, it's placing the unit in a social position of privilege within that religious community, metaphorically.
Okay.
So there are different arguments about that.
Very good. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Mari, did you have a quick question?
Well, I was waiting for someone else to add a voice in. So I do see another one. I realize we are a little bit past time. I think we can push this for a few more minutes without running into the next thing. People can just leave if they would like to. But I see a question from Sofia Magallanes saying, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Which text first prompted you to notice that the female abuse is giving voice to male abuse?
Ezekiel 23. So the early article I wrote, Should Our Sister Be Treated as a Whore, is discussing how the female figure is a metaphor for the male privileged audience. I didn't put it back then into terms of colonization, post-colonial theory. So that's what I'm adding now is this post-colonial context of how that's functioning. It was also pre-trauma theory stuff. That was a technical term stuff. Okay.
Okay, so I will just ask my last question then, and then we'll go ahead and close it up. So Corey, I'm just curious for you, in a larger scale, this project. I mean, I know that it's going into the wisdom commentary series and all of that, but is there a broader purpose for you here in terms of doing this work outside of the work itself?
I'm going to take out the contemporary stuff and put it in a festschrift that somebody has that I'm contributing to. But I do have, I've been thinking about a book. I do have it kind of penciled out, but there is so much work right now being done on rape that I'm not sure the book is needed anymore. So I don't think my outline works anymore. So who knows? I'm going to just do this right now, and then I'll do the next thing, and then maybe the next thing. Thank you for asking, Mari.
Yeah, great. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you again for this wonderful and again, very real presentation. Thank you to everyone who has been active and engaged, listening, conversationalist. Thank you, Mike, for coming on screen. We'll see you all at the next session.
Thank you.